to our second briefing, which is by, it's going to be Elizabeth Wilson, who is working with Professor Jossam and her team on the power of nature in Ecuador. So if we're ready for that, let's begin.
Yes, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Wilson and I'm going to be presenting today about our project, The Power of Nature, Accelerating Carbon Pricing Policies and Legal Framework for Ecuador, which we've been working on for Conservation International. And before we begin, I'd love to say a huge thank you to our whole workshop group for all their really hard work, as well as Professor Jossam for her guidance throughout the project, and of course to Carolina Rosero and Montserrat Alban, our client contacts. So this beautiful landscape that you see here is part of the Achua nationality's territory in Southeast Ecuador, sometimes described as Alfombra Verde con Rios, or a carpet of green with rivers. And the Achua nationalities inhabit an area that is over 90% forest, which is a precious but dwindling resource in Ecuador. The Sociobosque Program provides the Achua people and other indigenous groups with direct payments in return for protecting the forest they inhabit. And this allows them to have some breathing room to withstand financial challenges without resorting to harvesting trees on their land. However, due to funding cuts in the Ecuadorian government, the future of this program and others like it may be in jeopardy. So today, I'm going to help you understand our efforts to support the Sociobosque program through this project. I'll start with a brief overview of the client and project goals, then I'll describe the methodology we use for our analysis before sharing our results and our recommended approaches. Our client for this project is Conservation International, a nonprofit environmental organization working towards empowering societies to responsibly and sustainably care for nature, our global biodiversity, and the well-being of humanity. Our team has been working to help identify potential solutions to deforestation through carbon pricing mechanisms that we can share with decision makers and government representatives. And our focus is to find a way to leverage money from the private sector to sustainably fund conservation initiatives, primarily the Sociobosque program, that promote equity and work directly with indigenous forest communities. The Sociobosque program is an initiative of the government of Ecuador and was developed with the help of Conservation International, and it provides economic incentives to indigenous and rural communities that voluntarily commit to conserve their native forests. And it has a nationwide participation by indigenous and farmer communities, including the Achua nationality that we saw just before. And this Sociobosque program is part of a larger movement in Ecuador for increasing indigenous inclusion in government and development. And in 2008, the Constitution of Ecuador was amended to include greater focus on indigenous rights. And this included a recognition of the rights of nature within the Constitution. And it also included articles that prohibit the appropriation of natural or ecosystem services. A consequence of this is that any regulation of carbon dioxide through a market is unconstitutional, as it is seen as allowing for the appropriation of the absorption of carbon dioxide by Ecuador's forests. So in order to approach this project within these parameters, our methodology involved focusing our scope on 3 different models. These 3 models included 2 that are based on case studies of successful programs elsewhere, so a carbon tax and offset program in Colombia and a cap and trade program in California. And we also included a 3rd model focusing on the Ecuadorian carbon neutrality certification program. Our research included literature reviews, extensive interviews, and a quantitative financial analysis. And for each model, we considered what barriers exist to implementing a similar program in Ecuador and what sort of revenue might be generated from the initiative, as well as what the political and social outcomes would be, especially with regard to equity and indigenous rights. And once our analysis was conducted, we distilled our findings into 2 distinct approaches for Ecuador. One is based on the current political situation and constitution, and one is for if a window for change were to open. So Ecuador is currently in the run-up to a presidential election, so the political situation is quite uncertain for the future. And we wanted to make sure our client is prepared to make recommendations right now, and also prepared in the event that a policy window for constitutional change opens, that they can jump in and present some options then too. So as I said, our first option is based on a study of the system used in Colombia. And they use an emissions tax and offset system where polluters pay a tax on the amount of greenhouse gases they emit, or they can buy offsets to reduce their net emissions and reduce the amount of tax they pay. And while this has been successful in Colombia, we considered what the impacts would be if a similar system was implemented in Ecuador. And we projected that it could produce around $100 million of revenue for the government in the first year of operation, which is more than enough to support the Sociobosque program and other initiatives. However, there are several issues with this model, and these include political feasibility, as it's not currently politically possible. Also, the potentially regressive nature of carbon taxes, and crucially, that the offset part of this model violates the Constitution, as we saw earlier. The second model we considered is based on a case study of California's cap and trade system. And in this sort of system, you set a maximum amount of emissions, or a cap, and then you auction allowances to companies who want to emit pollution. And they can only emit as much as they have the allowances for, that they've either purchased through the initial auction or traded between themselves. And this has been implemented in California for several years now. And we estimate that if applied to Ecuador, this sort of system could generate approximately $23 million for the government in the first year. Now, this is significantly less than the carbon tax and offset system we just saw, but it would still mostly cover the Sociobosque program's annual costs. However, it faces similar challenges to the Colombia system, as it's currently not politically viable, and this sort of system can have larger effects on lower income households, and crucially, it violates that nature's rights part of the Constitution that we discussed. So in the third model, we considered the carbon neutrality certification, which is a program that has been in development for a while in Ecuador, but it hasn't yet come to fruition. And in this program, it provides a green certification for companies that measure, reduce, and offset their emissions. It is politically feasible, as it's currently being developed by the Ministry of Environment, and they have suggested it will be operational within 100 days. Crucially, it is allowed under the Constitution as well, so we get past that issue. However, it's really unclear how much revenue could be generated and whether or not this could even be a sustainable source of funding for the Sociobosque program. So to summarize the results of these three models, the main barrier we found was whether or not mechanisms are actually constitutionally allowed. And neither the carbon tax and offset nor the cap and trade is currently allowable under Ecuador's constitution, but the carbon neutrality certification is allowed. However, the main purpose for this analysis was figuring out how to generate revenue for conservation initiatives like the Sociobosque program. So the carbon tax and offset model would definitely provide more than enough revenue, and the cap and trade model should provide a significant amount of revenue. But with the carbon neutrality certification, it's really uncertain how much revenue could be generated. So given these results, we presented two separate recommended approaches. First, if the current constitution remains and the political situation remains as it is now, we have to respect the limitations on carbon pricing that it sets. Therefore, we recommend pursuing alternatives like this carbon neutrality certification. And to help its success, we recommend convening a working group on improving incentives with the Ministry of Environment and continuing to pursue international investment through other mechanisms. If a policy window were to open and it was possible to begin some constitutional change, we recommend either a carbon tax and offset or a cap and trade style system, as well as any other carbon crediting mechanisms that are available. And we'd have to be really mindful of the design of these systems, as equity and Indigenous rights can suffer as unintended consequences. So what does all this mean for the Achua people and the future of the Sociobosque program? Is it even possible to secure sustainable funding given these limits? Well, the Constitution is not set in stone in Ecuador. It changed in 2008, and it can change again. It's much easier to get changed than it is in the United States. And we have lots of reasons to be hopeful. There are so many international organizations that really want to invest in programs like these. And there's also a growing recognition that the best way to do conservation is to empower the Indigenous people. People like the Achua nationality, who will continue to protect Ecuador's forests for the future. And as one member of the community said, people used to destroy our forests for pastures. Now we are planting trees near our homes. We are giving our children something that they will take care of, that will be planted for their future. So thank you so much for listening today, and I would be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you. Questions?
You guys can again raise your digital Zoom hands or let us know in the chat if you have any questions. All right, Emily has a question.
Hi, Liz. Great presentation. You presented 3 potential models. Can you talk about how you landed on those 3 and whether there were others you considered?
Yeah, great question. So obviously there's many more models that we could have looked at, but that are between, you know, these national carbon tax or cap and trade systems and this carbon neutrality certification program. But obviously we had to narrow, you know, focus our analysis somehow. And so in this third model, although I focused on the carbon neutrality certification program in this presentation, in our analysis and what we're presenting to the client, we do explore you know, several other options that are out there and are already in existence. So other types of carbon crediting. There's a forest finance accelerator called Emergent that we've been looking into as well. And then in terms of the case studies themselves, we knew we wanted to look at Colombia because the client had expressed interest in their system, and given that the countries share some similarities, it seemed like a good approach. And then we originally wanted to, for the cap and trade program, look at a new program that's being implemented in Acre, Brazil. But unfortunately, that program is just so new, they don't have any data yet, and it was just not possible to make any meaningful analysis, even though if we had that data, it would be perhaps more readily applicable to Ecuador than the California model we used, which ultimately we used because of the availability of data and just the fact that it's been around for long enough for us to be able to look at the effects and draw some conclusions.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Okay.
I think that was the last one.
Do we have any others? No? Okay. Elizabeth, thank you. And thank you to the group. Very nice work.